You think county fairs after 1975 served the same foods as before? Think again. Something strange happened to fairground cuisine in the mid-70s. Entire categories of beloved treats simply vanished without explanation. No announcements, no farewells, just gone. Let's dig into 30 county fair foods that disappeared after 1975, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. Caramel corn balls were the signature treat of every county fair, enormous spheres of popcorn bound with thick, golden caramel that required two hands. Vendors made them fresh throughout the day, pouring hot caramel over massive batches in copper kettles, then shaping them by hand while wearing thick canvas gloves. The caramel developed a hard shell that crackled when bitten, giving way to sweeter, chewier layers underneath. These weren't dainty snacks, but substantial treats meant for sharing among families walking the midway, passing the sticky ball from person to person. At state fairs from Iowa to North Carolina, caramel cornball stands drew lines that wrapped around buildings, with families waiting 30 minutes for fresh batches. Vendors guarded their caramel recipes jealously, each claiming secret ratios of butter, corn syrup, and brown sugar that made theirs superior. Around 1976, these iconic treats vanished from fairgrounds with no clear explanation. Some blame liability concerns, others rising costs, but nobody knows why they disappeared so completely. Fried dough with cinnamon sugar was the original elephant ear, served as flat rounds rather than stretched-out ovals that replaced them after 1975. Vendors rolled balls of yeast dough into perfect circles 8 inches across, then dropped them into bubbling oil where they puffed like pillows, emerging golden brown and steaming. While scorching hot, they were tossed in paper bags filled with cinnamon and white sugar, shaken vigorously until every surface glistened. The texture was completely different from modern elephant ears, puffier, more bread-like, with a tender interior that absorbed cinnamon sugar into pockets of sweetness. Families bought them by the half dozen, stacking them in cardboard trays while watching livestock, judging, or carnival rides. The dough recipe was crucial. Too much yeast made them tough, too little made them dense. Experienced vendors judged oil temperature by sound alone, listening for the exact sizzle that meant perfect frying. By 1977, these had almost vanished, replaced by thinner, crisper elephant ears that dominated thereafter. Candied apples on sticks featured genuine apples coated in hard red candy shells that shattered like glass when bitten through to fruit beneath. Unlike modern caramel apples, these had thin, brittle sugar coating made from corn syrup, red dye, and cinnamon boiled to hard crack stage at exactly 300 degrees. Apples had to be room temperature and completely dry or coating wouldn't stick, so vendors polished each one with clean towels before dipping. The coating cooled in seconds, creating glossy red shells so shiny you could see your reflection. Children loved them despite eating difficulties, cracking through candy with front teeth, then working around the apple while avoiding sharp candy shards. The contrast between cold, tarred apple and sweet cinnamon-flavored coating created an entirely different experience from caramel versions. At Midwest and Southern county fairs, candied apple stands were mandatory stops, their displays featuring dozens of gleaming red apples arranged in pyramids on wooden boards. Something changed after 1975. Perhaps concerns about choking on candy pieces, but these classics disappeared almost overnight. Homemade taffy pulls were interactive entertainment where fairgoers watched vendors stretch fresh taffy on wall-mounted hooks, creating ribbons of candy cut into bite-sized pieces and sold immediately. Taffy was made fresh every few hours in copper kettles, cooked to softball stage, then poured onto marble slabs to cool just enough for handling. Vendors wearing thick gloves gathered the warm mass and began mesmerizing, pulling over metal hooks, bolted to wooden frames, stretching taffy into long ropes that doubled back on themselves hundreds of times. This incorporated air bubbles that gave the finished candy its characteristic chewy texture and lighter color. Crowds gathered to watch the rhythmic pulling motion and the gradual transformation from transparent amber to opaque cream. Flavors were simple: vanilla, peppermint, molasses, but intensely concentrated, and the texture was perfect. neither too hard nor too sticky. Children often participated under supervision, learning traditional candy-making craft while creating their own pieces. These demonstrations disappeared after 1975, replaced by pre-packaged saltwater taffy that lacked homemade versions' superior flavor and texture. Pickle juice snow cones combined shaved ice with briny, vinegary liquid from pickle barrels, creating a salty, sour treat that sounds bizarre but was wildly popular at Southern state fairs. Vendors shaved blocks of ice into fluffy snow using hand-cranked machines, packed it into paper cones, then ladled pickle brine over the top until it soaked through like savory syrup. Pickle juice came from massive wooden barrels that also supplied pickles for deep frying or eating straight. The flavor was intensely salty and tangy, completely different from sweet snow cones, appealing to fairgoers who'd spent hours in summer heat and craved salt replacement. Pregnant women were particularly devoted customers, sometimes buying 3 or 4 in a single fair visit. The combination of cold, refreshing ice with concentrated pickle flavor created something strangely addictive. People either loved it passionately or found it completely revolting. At fairs in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, pickle juice snow cone stands did as much business as traditional sweet versions. The treat vanished around 1976, possibly due to health regulations about using pickle brine. Buttermilk donuts were dense, cake-style donuts fried fresh, and served warm with nothing but powdered sugar dusting. Unlike light, yeast-raised donuts that became standard after 1975, these were made from thick batter enriched with real buttermilk, creating tender crumb with subtle tang that balanced sweetness. Vendors dropped spoonfuls of batter into hot oil using special donut droppers, watching as each one puffed up and developed golden brown crusts that sealed in moisture. Buttermilk reacted with baking soda to create tiny air pockets throughout, giving the donuts their characteristic tender texture without being fluffy or light. These were substantial, filling treats that satisfied hunger rather than providing just sugar rushes. Powdered sugar was applied by placing warm donuts in paper bags with confectioner's sugar and shaking vigorously, a job often given to children working the booth. The slight tanginess from buttermilk distinguished these from ordinary cake donuts, creating more complex flavor that adults particularly appreciated. County fairs from Pennsylvania to Kansas featured buttermilk donut stands as morning staples. After 1975, these disappeared rapidly, replaced by yeast donuts or pre-made varieties. Roasted corn and husks was prepared differently before 1975, soaked in salted water for hours, then roasted in husks directly over charcoal fires rather than boiled or steamed. Vendors maintained massive charcoal grills where dozens of corn ears roasted simultaneously, turned constantly with long tongs to achieve even charring. Soaking prevented husks from catching fire while adding moisture that steamed kernels from the outside in. The result was corn with distinctly smoky flavor and slightly charred kernels that popped between teeth, completely different from boiled corn's soft sweetness. Customers could choose their butter and salt application level, and vendors would peel back just enough husk to create a handle, leaving most corn wrapped in its natural covering to retain heat. Charcoal gave the corn complexity that gas grills couldn't match, with each ear slightly different depending on its position over coals. At Midwestern state fairs, roasted corn stands were essential stops, their smoke visible across fairgrounds. Something changed after 1975. Perhaps propane became more economical than charcoal, but the distinctive charcoal roasted version disappeared, replaced by boiled corn that lacked smoky depth. Vinegar fries were thick-cut potato fries served with malt vinegar as default condiment, creating tangy, British-style fair food that was hugely popular before disappearing around 1976. Potatoes were cut thick, almost steak fry size, and fried twice, once at lower temperature to cook through, then again at high heat to crisp exterior while keeping inside fluffy. Vendors piled them into paper cones while scorching hot, then liberally splashed malt vinegar over the top until fries were soaked. Vinegar would soak into potatoes' interior, while exterior remained crispy, creating sharp, tangy flavor completely different from ketchup's sweetness. Salt was applied heavily, creating balance between salty, sour, and natural earthiness of potato. These were working-class fair food, popular at agricultural fairs where farming families appreciated their substantial, no-nonsense character. Vinegar cut through grease in ways ketchup never could, making it possible to eat more without feeling heavy. At fairs in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, vinegar fries competed equally with traditional ketchup versions. Their disappearance after 1975 remains mysterious. Perhaps American tastes shifted away from vinegar's tartness. Molasses popcorn was an alternative to caramel corn, featuring dark molasses coating instead of light caramel, creating deeper, more complex sweetness with slight bitterness that adults particularly loved. Vendors popped corn in massive kettles, then poured in a mixture of molasses, butter, and brown sugar cooked to soft crack stage. The mixture was tossed constantly with long wooden paddles until every kernel was coated in glossy dark brown syrup. Unlike caramel corn's hard crunch, molasses popcorn had slightly softer, chewier texture that stuck to teeth satisfyingly. The molasses flavor was robust and slightly mineral with depth that plain sugar couldn't provide, appealing to fairgoers tired of relentlessly sweet treats. The coating was less prone to burning than caramel, making it easier for vendors to produce consistently good batches throughout long fair days. At Southern state fairs, molasses popcorn was as common as caramel versions, with many families preferring its more sophisticated flavor profile. Lemonade made from real lemons was pressed fresh at fairgrounds using massive mechanical juicers that fairgoers could watch in operation, creating entertainment along with refreshment. Vendors displayed crates of fresh lemons, feeding them one by one into heavy cast-iron presses that extracted juice into glass containers visible to customers. Juice was mixed with water and sugar in large glass dispensers, creating lemonade that was cloudy with pulp and natural lemon oils, tasting completely different from clear, artificial versions that replaced it. The tartness was genuine and sharp, requiring significant sugar to balance, creating a drink that tasted like actual lemons rather than lemon flavoring. Vendors adjusted sweetness throughout the day based on customer feedback, making each batch slightly different. The spectacle of watching lemons being pressed was part of the appeal. Children would stop to watch mechanical arms squeeze each lemon, fascinated by simple machinery. Glass dispensers kept lemonade cold with blocks of ice, and the cloudiness of fresh juice looked appetizing rather than unclear. Sorghum candy sticks were hard candies made from sorghum syrup instead of corn syrup, giving them distinctive mineral sweetness and dark amber color that looked almost like glass. Vendors cooked sorghum with sugar to hard crack stage, then poured mixture onto marble slabs and cut it into sticks while still pliable. The candy hardened into translucent rods resembling amber, breaking with sharp edges that dissolved slowly on the tongue. The flavor was complex, sweet but earthy, with slight bitterness that prevented it from being cloying like regular hard candies. Sorghum was a traditional southern sweetener, more affordable than refined sugar, giving these candies historical authenticity that appealed to older fairgoers who remembered when sorghum was common. Children would make them last for hours, sucking on one stick throughout an entire afternoon at the fair. The candy's hardness meant it was virtually indestructible, surviving being carried in pockets or dropped on dusty fairgrounds without damage. Fried pies were hand pies filled with fruit preserves and deep-fried until crust became crispy and golden, completely different from modern baked versions. Vendors rolled out pastry dough, cut it into circles, filled half with fruit filling, usually apple, peach, or cherry, then folded and crimped edges to seal. The pies were dropped into hot oil where they puffed up and became golden brown in minutes. Frying created crust that was simultaneously crispy and flaky, while fruit filling inside became scorching hot and concentrated in flavor. These were eaten hot, often burning roofs of mouths, with fruit juices exploding out with first bites. The dough was usually lard-based pastry, creating richness that butter couldn't match and helping it fry without absorbing excessive oil. At Southern state fairs, fried pie stands were breakfast staples and afternoon snacks, with vendors making fresh batches every hour to ensure crispy crusts. Peanut brittle was made fresh at county fairs in copper kettles visible to customers, creating thin sheets of candy studded with whole roasted peanuts that vendors would crack into irregular pieces. The process required precise temperature control, sugar, corn syrup, and butter cooked to exactly 300 degrees, then raw peanuts were added and cooked briefly until they toasted. Baking soda was stirred in at the last second, causing mixture to foam and lighten. Then it was immediately poured onto greased marble slabs where it spread into thin sheets. The candy had to cool for exactly the right amount of time. Too long and it became impossibly hard, too short and it was sticky, before being cracked into pieces with small hammers. The resulting brittle was thinner and crispier than commercially produced versions, with better peanut distribution and fresher flavor. The peanuts were visible throughout, roasted to perfect doneness without burning. At fairs in Georgia, Alabama, and Virginia, fresh peanut brittle was regional pride, showcasing local peanut crops. Hickory smoked turkey legs were genuine whole turkey legs smoked for hours over hickory wood fires, creating meat so tender it fell off the bone, completely different from the dry, chewy versions sold at modern fairs. Vendors maintained actual smokers at fairgrounds, loading fresh turkey legs each morning and smoking them slowly all day over smoldering hickory logs. The smoke penetrated deep into meat, creating pink smoke rings and flavor that permeated every bite. The skin became dark mahogany and crispy, while fat rendered slowly throughout cooking, keeping meat moist. These were enormous. Some legs weighed over a pound, providing substantial meals that could feed multiple people. The hickory smoke gave distinctly sweet, complex flavor that mesquite or other woods couldn't match, creating taste fundamentally different from modern versions smoked over gas-fed smoke generators. Customers could watch their turkey legs being pulled from smokers and wrapped in foil, still hot enough to steam when unwrapped. Homemade root beer was brewed on-site at county fairs in massive wooden barrels, creating complex herbal beverage completely different from commercial root beer's simple sweetness. Vendors would start batches days before fairs opened, combining sassafras root bark, wintergreen sarsaparilla, birch bark, and other herbs in precise proportions handed down through generations. The mixture steeped in cold water for hours, then yeast and sugar were added to create natural carbonation through fermentation. The resulting root beer had low alcohol content, usually under 1%, but intense flavor with herbal complexity and natural effervescence that was gentler than forced carbonation. It was served cold from taps installed in wooden barrels, poured into glass mugs that fairgoers would drink and return. The foam was creamy and thick, the color darker than commercial versions, and the flavor was simultaneously sweet, herbal, and slightly bitter. At Pennsylvania and Midwestern fairs, root beer stands were institutions, with families returning year after year for the same vendor's specific recipe. Sugared pecans were made in copper kettles at fairgrounds, coating whole pecans in crystallized sugar through labor-intensive process that created glossy, crunchy shells around tender nuts. Vendors would heat sugar with water and butter until it reached soft ball stage, then add raw pecans and stir constantly over medium heat. As moisture evaporated, sugar would crystallize around each pecan, creating white sandy coatings that eventually became glossy and smooth with continued stirring. The process took nearly an hour per batch, requiring constant attention and specific stirring techniques to prevent burning. The finished pecans were perfectly coated, with sugar shells that crunched between teeth before giving way to rich, slightly bitter pecans underneath. The contrast between sweet coating and earthy nuts created balance that prevented them from being cloying. These were sold in paper sacks, still slightly warm, with sugar crystals that sparkled like frost. At Southern state fairs, sugared pecan stands were mandatory stops, their sweet smell drawing crowds from across midways. Batter-fried vegetables were offered at every fair before 1975. Not just onion rings, but squash, mushrooms, okra, green tomatoes, and even cauliflower, creating variety that disappeared when onion rings became the sole option. The batter was typically buttermilk-based with cornmeal, creating crispy, slightly tangy coating that complemented each vegetable's specific flavor. Vendors would slice vegetables fresh throughout the day, dip them in batter, and fry them to order in massive cast-iron kettles filled with peanut oil or lard. The variety meant fairgoers could sample different vegetables without committing to entire orders, creating opportunities to try unfamiliar foods. Squash rings were particularly popular, their mild sweetness balanced by crispy, salty batter. Mushrooms became concentrated and meaty when fried. Okra's sliminess disappeared, leaving just tender vegetable and crunchy coating. Green tomatoes provided tartness that cut through batter's richness. Each vegetable required slightly different frying times and temperatures, making these offerings labor-intensive but worthwhile. At county fairs throughout the South and Midwest, fried vegetable stands displayed their full variety prominently, encouraging experimentation. After 1975, nearly all these stands simplified to onion rings exclusively, likely for economic efficiency. Sausage and peppers sandwiches were served differently before 1975. The sausages were grilled over charcoal rather than flat-top griddles, and peppers and onions were roasted directly in cast-iron pans over the same fire. This cooking method created complex, smoky flavors completely different from modern versions. The Italian sausages were fresh, not pre-cooked, splitting and crackling over charcoal while fat dripped onto coals, creating aromatic smoke that infused the meat. Peppers, usually a mix of green bell and long hot peppers, were charred until skins blackened and interior flesh became sweet and soft. Onions were sliced thick and roasted until edges caramelized. Everything was served on hard rolls that had been toasted on the grill, creating crusty exterior that soaked up juices without dissolving. The combination of charred vegetables, smoky sausage, and toasted bread created a sandwich with depth that flat-top cooking couldn't match. At Italian festivals and county fairs in the Northeast, these sandwiches were legendary, with vendors cooking over massive charcoal grills visible from across fairgrounds. Cotton candy was made differently before 1975, spun by hand on wooden cones rather than paper sticks, creating nests of sugar that were denser and more substantial than modern versions. Vendors used commercial cotton candy machines, but the technique involved careful cone manipulation to create layered, rose-shaped masses that weighed significantly more than today's wispy portions. The sugar was tinted with food coloring directly in the machine, creating intense colors, electric pink, bright blue, or lemon yellow, that stained fingers and mouths. The spinning process took longer, with vendors building up layers of spun sugar deliberately, creating cotton candy that had structure and weight rather than dissolving instantly on the tongue. The wooden cones were reusable, returned by customers and sanitized for reuse, making them more sustainable than disposable sticks. The cotton candy had texture variation, denser at the core where layers compressed, lighter at exterior where recent spinning left delicate strands. This created an eating experience that progressed from wispy sweetness to concentrated sugar as you worked toward the center. Candied yams were served as fair food before 1975, thick rounds of sweet potato baked in brown sugar, butter, and spices, then served hot in paper dishes as side dishes or standalone snacks. Vendors would prepare massive roasting pans full of sliced yams, layering them with butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and sometimes orange juice, then baking until tops caramelized and yams became almost jammy in texture. This was soul food at its finest, bringing traditional holiday dishes to fairgrounds where they became accessible as casual food. The yams were served with spoons, almost like dessert, though many people ate them as side dishes alongside fried chicken or pork. The sweetness was intense but balanced by the yams' natural earthiness, and spices added complexity that prevented them from being one-dimensional. At Southern state fairs and church fairs, candied yams were staples that showcased African-American culinary traditions, connecting fairgoers to heritage and home cooking. Funnel cake was smaller and lighter before 1975, made with different batter that created more delicate, lace-like patterns rather than thick, doughy masses sold today. The batter was thinner, almost crepe-like in consistency, poured through funnels in careful spirals that spread into plates of crispy, interconnected ribbons. The frying created hundreds of thin edges that became extra crispy, while centers stayed tender, creating textural variety in every bite. Powdered sugar was applied lightly, just enough to sweeten without overwhelming, allowing the fried dough's subtle flavor to shine through. These original funnel cakes were elegant rather than heavy, satisfying sweet cravings without leaving you feeling overly full. Vendors took pride in creating perfect spirals, with some developing signature patterns that regular customers recognized. The cakes were served on paper plates but were structurally sound enough to eat while walking, something modern thicker versions can't manage without falling apart. Watermelon by the slice was served ice-cold at county fairs, cut into massive wedges from whole melons, chilled in galvanized tubs filled with ice. Vendors would display entire watermelons, cutting them fresh to order so customers could see bright red flesh and know they were getting quality. The melons were served without plates or forks, just handed over as enormous wedges that required 2 hands to hold and generated juice that ran down arms and dripped onto the ground. The ice-cold temperature made them intensely refreshing during hot summer afternoons, while sweetness provided quick energy. Eating watermelon at the fair was messy. Social experience. Families would sit together on benches or grass, spitting seeds and laughing at each other's juice-covered faces. Vendors sourced melons locally when possible, creating connection between fairgoers and regional agriculture. The size of slices was generous, often weighing several pounds each, making them shareable and economical. Caramel apples were different before 1975, made with darker, more intensely flavored caramel that contained real cream and butter, creating rich coating that tasted distinctly of cooked dairy rather than just sweet. Vendors would make caramel fresh in copper kettles, cooking sugar, cream, butter, and vanilla until mixture turned deep amber and smelled like butterscotch. Apples were dipped while caramel was still hot enough to coat smoothly, but cool enough not to slide off, creating even glossy layers. The caramel hardened to firm but not brittle texture, requiring substantial biting force to break through while staying chewy rather than crunchy. This was adult caramel, sophisticated rather than simple, with slight bitterness from caramelized sugars balancing sweetness. The apples underneath were usually tart varieties that provided flavor contrast, making each bite a balance between sweet caramel and sharp fruit. Sticks were wooden rather than paper, sturdy enough to support heavy coating and substantial apple. Honey sticks were natural candy sold at county fairs, consisting of honey sealed in plastic straws that children would bite open and suck, providing pure sweetness without processing or additives. Beekeepers would sell these at fairs, often alongside jars of honey and beeswax products, using them as introductions to their offerings. The honey varied depending on what flowers the bees had visited. Clover honey was mild and light. Wildflower honey was complex and dark. Orange blossom honey had citrus notes. Children loved them because they could control the flow by biting carefully, making a single stick last through entire afternoons at the fair. Parents appreciated that honey was natural sweetener providing quick energy without refined sugar's crash. The honey sticks also educated fairgoers about beekeeping and honey production, creating connections between food and agriculture. Vendors would explain different honey varieties, encouraging customers to taste several types before buying. Fried chicken was sold by the piece at county fairs, prepared fresh in massive cast-iron skillets over open flames or large propane burners, creating crispy, grease-free chicken completely different from modern deep-fried versions. Church groups and community organizations often ran these stands as fundraisers, using recipes passed down through generations of church suppers and family gatherings. The chicken was often marinated overnight in buttermilk seasoned with salt, pepper, and secret spice combinations, then dredged in seasoned flour just before frying. The skillets required constant attention, with cooks turning pieces regularly to ensure even browning without burning. The result was chicken with incredibly crispy skin that shattered when bitten, while meat inside stayed moist and flavorful. The pieces were sold hot, wrapped in paper towels that absorbed excess oil, making them relatively neat to eat despite being fried. At southern state fairs and county fairs throughout the Midwest, fried chicken stands were institutions where families could get complete meals of chicken, rolls, and coleslaw. Strawberry shortcake was assembled to order at county fairs, featuring fresh strawberries macerated in sugar, genuine whipped cream beaten by hand, and shortcake that was actually biscuit-like rather than sponge cake. Vendors would bake shortcake throughout the day, creating rounds of lightly sweetened biscuits that were split while still warm. Fresh strawberries that had been sliced and sugared hours earlier had released their juices, creating naturally sweet syrup. Cream was whipped to soft peaks just before service. Vendors often worked in pairs, with one assembling shortcakes while another whipped cream in large bowls. The components were layered generously. Shortcake bottom, strawberries with syrup, whipped cream, shortcake top, more strawberries and cream. The result was messy but glorious, requiring spoons to eat as shortcake absorbed strawberry juice and cream melted slightly from residual heat. This was peak season food, available only when strawberries were fresh and affordable. At spring and early summer fairs, strawberry shortcake stands were beloved traditions, often run by church ladies groups or agricultural extension organizations. Beef barbecue sandwiches were genuine pit-smoked beef before 1975, not the quick-smoked or oven-roasted versions sold at modern fairs. Vendors would maintain actual barbecue pits at fairgrounds, smoking beef shoulders or briskets for 12 to 18 hours over hickory or oak wood fires. The meat developed deep smoke rings and bark. The dark, crusty exterior formed from rendered fat and caramelized rub. When pulled apart, the beef was so tender it shredded with minimal effort while retaining enough texture to have substance. The barbecue sauce was usually served on the side or applied sparingly, allowing smoke flavor and meat quality to dominate. The buns were often grilled or toasted, sturdy enough to hold generous portions of beef without disintegrating. At Midwestern and Southern fairs, barbecue stands were centerpieces, their smoke visible across fairgrounds and their smell drawing crowds from amazing distances. The pits were usually visible to customers, creating entertainment value alongside food. Vendors took tremendous pride in their specific techniques: wood choices, rub compositions, cooking temperatures, and timing. Kettle corn was popped in massive copper kettles right at fairgrounds, creating sweet-salty combination that was served warm and disappeared rapidly. Unlike modern kettle corn, which is often made ahead and served at room temperature, the original was scooped hot from kettles into paper bags that became translucent with butter. Vendors would pop corn in batches, adding sugar at precisely the right moment during popping so it caramelized slightly without burning. The timing was crucial. Too early and sugar burned, too late and it didn't properly coat popcorn. The result had irregular sweetness, with some kernels heavily coated and others barely touched, creating flavor variation in every handful. The salt was added at the end, creating balance between sweet and savory that was more complex than modern versions that taste primarily sweet. The warm temperature meant butter was liquid, distributing evenly throughout the bag, while caramelized sugar was still slightly soft. At fairs throughout the Midwest and Pennsylvania Dutch country, kettle corn vendors were essential stops, their kettles dramatic focal points where crowds gathered to watch. Homemade ice cream was hand-churned at county fairs using old-fashioned wooden bucket freezers packed with ice and rock salt, creating frozen custard-style treat far richer than anything made in electric machines. Vendors would start with custard base made from real cream, milk, eggs, and sugar, cooked together until thick, then chilled overnight. At the fair, this base was poured into the inner metal can of the churn, surrounded by crushed ice mixed with rock salt that lowered the freezing point dramatically. The churning required manual labor. Vendors would turn cranks steadily for 20 to 30 minutes until mixture thickened, then let it rest packed in ice until firm. The result was incredibly dense, creamy ice cream with no air incorporated, completely different from modern soft serve or commercially produced ice cream. Flavors were simple: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, but intensely concentrated because they came from real ingredients rather than extracts. The ice cream was served in cardboard cups or cones, so cold it created instant headaches, but so rich it satisfied completely. At agricultural fairs where dairy farming was celebrated, homemade ice cream represented quality of local dairy products. Apple cider was pressed fresh at county fairs using portable cider presses, creating unfiltered juice served cold in paper cups that tasted completely different from commercial cider. Orchardists would bring bushels of apples, usually a mix of varieties chosen for balanced sweetness and acidity, and press them throughout the day. Fairgoers could watch whole apples being fed into grinders that reduced them to pulp, which was then pressed hydraulically to extract juice. The cider came out cloudy with fine particles of apple suspended throughout, and it was served immediately, often still cold from being stored on ice. The flavor was intense and fresh, tasting like concentrated apples rather than sweet juice, with complexity that came from variety blend. Some ciders were tart enough to make your face pucker, others were naturally sweet, and the best balanced both qualities perfectly. The cider contained no preservatives, which meant it had to be consumed within days or it would begin fermenting naturally. At fall fairs throughout apple-growing regions, fresh cider pressing was as much demonstration as sales, educating fairgoers about traditional agricultural practices. Broccoli with hollandaise sauce was the 1970s way of making vegetables feel luxurious. The bright green florets, steamed to perfection, were draped in silky, buttery sauce made from egg yolks and lemon. It turned an ordinary vegetable into something elegant enough for a dinner party. Hollandaise sauce gave everything it touched a golden sheen, a sign that the meal was special. Families who wanted a touch of restaurant-style dining found their answer here. Some added paprika or fresh herbs for color, others spooned it carefully onto platters beside the main course. The richness of the sauce paired perfectly with the freshness of the broccoli, creating balance on the plate and comfort in every bite. This was the era when presentation mattered, when a simple side could feel like a triumph. Even today, one bite of broccoli with hollandaise reminds you why 1970s cooks loved to show off just a little at the holidays. Goulash with elbow macaroni was a hearty, crowd-pleasing dish that fit perfectly into the 1970s budget-conscious kitchen. Ground beef was browned with onions, then simmered in a tomato-based sauce seasoned with paprika, garlic, and sometimes a pinch of sugar for balance. Elbow macaroni was cooked right in the sauce, soaking up every bit of flavor while saving on extra pots to wash. This dish was ideal for stretching a small amount of meat across multiple servings, with the pasta and sauce providing the bulk of the meal. It could be served immediately for dinner or reheated for lunches throughout the week without losing its appeal. In many households, goulash became a go-to for family gatherings or church suppers because it was inexpensive, filling, and easy to make in large quantities. The paprika gave it a warm, distinctive taste that stood out from other pasta dishes, and its simplicity meant even beginner cooks could master it. Many families added their own twists, extra vegetables, cheese, or herbs to suit their tastes. The end result was always a steaming, satisfying plate of food that comforted on cold nights and stretched the grocery budget just a little bit further with every serving. Spam and eggs was the morning meal of those who had little time, little money, but still wanted to start the day with something warm. That metal can, with its unmistakable pop and salty perfume, was a fixture on the counter in countless kitchens. Spam did not pretend to be fancy. It was a slab of meat that laughed in the face of labels. Sliced thick, fried until the edges crisped and curled, it sat next to scrambled eggs like an old friend who never judged. And the eggs, sometimes fresh, sometimes powdered, were fluffed just enough to give you the illusion of plenty. This was the kind of breakfast that filled bellies before school and work, when the house still smelled like sleep and the only sound was the sizzle from the pan. It was fast, it was cheap, and it worked. In many homes, it was the meal you had on the mornings that really mattered. The test day, the double shift, the long ride ahead. Spam and eggs never won awards, but it never needed to. It showed up. It stayed reliable. And for all its simplicity, it left behind the kind of warmth that never really fades. Gazpacho shots brought a cool Mediterranean breeze to warm American evenings and made every casual gathering feel like a fashionable European cafe. Ripe tomatoes, crisp cucumbers, green peppers, and a splash of red wine vinegar were blended until smooth and then chilled until the flavors mingled into a refreshing soup. Instead of serving it in a traditional bowl, Hosts poured the mixture into tiny shot glasses or small tumblers, turning a humble peasant dish into a glamorous party starter. Guests could sip it like a drink or tip the glass back in one smooth motion, savoring the cold burst of garden-fresh flavor that cooled the palate instantly. Preparation was wonderfully simple. A few minutes with a blender, a quick rest in the refrigerator, and it was ready. This dish appealed to health-conscious diners exploring lighter fare and adventurous partygoers eager to try Spanish-inspired flavors. In an era obsessed with convenience but open to international ideas, gazpacho shots delivered sophistication without a single moment near the stove. Their bright color and lively taste made them an unforgettable highlight of any 1970s soiree, proving that 5-minute recipes could indeed be both bold and refined. Vegetable pot pie without meat was a savory, budget-conscious dish that used whatever vegetables were available, baked under a simple crust to create a filling and comforting meal in the 1970s. This pie relied on affordable staples like potatoes, carrots, peas, and onions, mixed in a creamy sauce made from pantry basics like milk and flour. The crust was often homemade with flour and shortening, keeping costs low and preparation simple. Baking the pie allowed families to transform inexpensive vegetables into a hearty, warm dinner that could feed multiple people. It was especially popular during seasons when fresh meat was scarce or expensive, proving that vegetables alone could deliver satisfaction. The flaky crust added texture and substance, making each bite feel special despite the frugality behind it. Vegetable pot pie highlighted how 1970s cooks used ingenuity and basic ingredients to create meals that felt like a treat while keeping family budgets intact. Salmon mousse was a pink, wobbly monument to culinary optimism. It arrived on a platter in the shape of a fish, its scales carefully detailed by a copper mold. Inside, pureed salmon, whipped with cream and held together with unflavored gelatin. Cold, smooth, and hauntingly oceanic. It was a staple of holiday buffets and garden luncheons, the kind of dish that required no chewing and even less questioning. Sprigs of parsley tried to make it look alive. Lemon slices hinted at freshness. But beneath it all was the taste of canned fish and ambition. Women's magazines called it elegant. Guests called it interesting. Children called it gross. And still, it reappeared year after year because it made you look like you tried. That was the real magic. Not the flavor, but the effort it implied. You didn't just open a can, you molded a vision. One that jiggled, glistened, and dared you to admire it. Salmon mousse was never about appetite. It was about achievement. Cheese souffle with paprika crust was a masterpiece of the 1970s kitchen, a dish that tested your patience but rewarded it with every bite. Light, fluffy, and full of melted cheese, it rose tall and proud in glass Pyrex dishes. The paprika sprinkled on top baked into a golden crust that hinted at spice and warmth. It was one of those dishes that demanded attention. You could not slam the oven door or it might fall. But when it turned out right, it felt like triumph. Hosts loved serving it at Christmas brunches or New Year's dinners, where its airy texture balanced heavier fare. It was comfort disguised as elegance, a humble blend of eggs, milk, and cheese that became something grand. In a decade obsessed with presentation, the souffle was both showpiece and soul food. Its fall from popularity says more about our rush than its worth. One forkful, and you would remember why patience used to taste this good. Cornbread and pinto beans was a meal deeply rooted in Southern cooking that found its way into frugal kitchens across America during the 1970s. Pinto beans simmered slowly with onions, salt, and maybe just a scrap of ham or bacon for richness were served alongside or spooned over wedges of golden cornbread. The beans provided hearty protein and a savory earthiness, while the cornbread brought sweetness and a crumbly texture that made every bite satisfying. Cooking the beans low and slow allowed them to develop a depth of flavor that paired beautifully with the slightly crisp edges of skillet-baked cornbread. The dish was incredibly inexpensive, feeding a family for pennies and offering leftovers that were just as good reheated the next day. Many households considered this the ultimate comfort meal, perfect for cold evenings when something simple yet filling was needed. Butter melting into a hot slice of cornbread next to a steaming bowl of beans was a humble pleasure that carried generations of tradition. More than just a meal, it was a reminder of resourcefulness, resilience, and the beauty of making something wonderful from basic, affordable ingredients. Devonshire tea sandwiches offered a gentle nod to classic British afternoon gatherings while perfectly suiting the brisk rhythm of American entertaining in the 1970s. Thin slices of soft white bread were spread lightly with sweet butter, then layered with delicate watercress leaves that brought a peppery freshness. The sandwiches were trimmed of crusts and cut into tidy rectangles or triangles, creating a clean, graceful look that appealed to both casual and formal crowds. Hosts could prepare an entire platter in just minutes, stacking the dainty pieces on silver trays or colorful plates to match the occasion. Despite their simplicity, the sandwiches carried a quiet sophistication that felt right at home at bridal showers, garden parties, or holiday teas. The mild butteriness balanced the bright green snap of the watercress, offering a subtle but memorable flavor that never overwhelmed the palate. Guests appreciated the lightness after richer fare and loved the way these sandwiches paired with hot tea or a chilled sparkling drink. Quick to assemble yet timeless in presentation, Devonshire tea sandwiches demonstrated how a few quality ingredients could create a moment of refined pleasure in less than 5 minutes. Vegetable and cheese quesadillas were a speedy, budget-friendly meal that used simple tortillas stuffed with whatever affordable vegetables and cheese were on hand. During the 1970s, tortillas were an economical pantry staple, and pairing them with inexpensive veggies like bell peppers, onions, or canned corn made for a satisfying meal that did not break the bank. The cheese, often a mild, budget-friendly variety, melted into the warm, crispy tortillas, creating a delicious contrast of textures. These quesadillas were quick to prepare, making them ideal for busy families needing a filling meal in minutes. The flexibility of this dish meant leftovers could be turned into quesadillas with ease, stretching ingredients further and reducing waste. Served with a side of simple salsa or sour cream if available, they added a bit of excitement to the dinner table. Vegetable and cheese quesadillas perfectly captured the essence of practical home cooking in the 1970s. Easy, adaptable, and delicious without requiring expensive ingredients or fancy techniques. There was something ceremonious about the way it jiggled. Molded vegetable salad wasn't just a side dish, it was centerpiece theater. A ring of lime or tomato gelatin captured peas, carrots, celery, and sometimes even olives, suspended mid-wiggle like they were caught in a culinary time warp. Housewives of the 50s and 60s believed this was the epitome of presentation. Nutrition locked inside shimmering, fruit-colored architecture, it showed off your fridge and your social status. Was it good? That depends on whether you enjoyed the experience of biting into sweet gelatin only to hit a green bean. The mouth couldn't quite decide if it was being treated or punished. At church potlucks, it gleamed under fluorescent lights next to potato salads and deviled eggs. Kids poked it. Adults took polite slivers. And someone's aunt always said it reminded her of something she saw in Good Housekeeping. Molded vegetable salad was a fever dream of food science, made by those brave enough to ignore texture clashes in the name of spectacle. And yet, behind its quivering form lay an odd kind of pride. This was the future of food, or at least that's what they hoped. Apple celery Waldorf mold was one of the most delightfully strange yet beloved creations of the 1970s. It took the classic Waldorf salad, apples, celery, and walnuts in creamy dressing, and turned it into a jiggling work of art. Using unflavored gelatin, cooks suspended the mixture in shimmering molds shaped like rings or stars. It was the kind of dish that looked straight out of a vintage magazine, equal parts fancy and playful. Served on lettuce leaves or a crystal platter, it added color and conversation to the table. The flavors were light, crisp, and just sweet enough to balance all the savory dishes around it. Some people added grapes or diced pineapple for extra flair. For all its quirks, the apple celery Waldorf mold captured the era's fascination with presentation. Food as decoration. Though gelatin dishes fell out of favor, there's still something irresistible about their nostalgic glow. They remind us that once, Every side dish was a small celebration of creativity. Homemade pot pie with biscuit topping offered the comfort of a classic without the expense of store-bought frozen versions. Instead of a traditional pie crust, which could be time-consuming and require more costly butter, cooks topped the filling with drop biscuits made from flour, milk, and shortening. The filling was a clever way to use up leftover meats, most often chicken, turkey, or beef, combined with inexpensive vegetables like peas, carrots, and potatoes in a creamy sauce thickened with flour. The biscuit topping baked into a golden, tender layer that absorbed some of the savory filling, making every bite warm and satisfying. For many families, this dish was a perfect example of turning odds and ends into something that felt like a treat. The aroma of the biscuits baking with the bubbling filling underneath made the whole kitchen smell inviting. It was a meal that blended frugality with a sense of homey indulgence. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze was not just a dish, it was a ritual. Every family had their version, passed down or made up, and somehow they all tasted like home. Ground beef stretched with breadcrumbs and eggs, seasoned with whatever was left in the spice rack, shaped into a loaf and topped with a thick smear of sweet ketchup, then baked until the glaze bubbled and caramelized at the edges. This was not fancy food. It was not supposed to be. It was designed to last, to satisfy, to keep you going. It fed families through layoffs and long winters, and it tasted better on day 2. Sliced cold and slapped between 2 slices of bread. Some added onions, some added oatmeal, some swore by the secret of a splash of milk or a dash of Worcestershire sauce. But it was never about the ingredients. It was about the intention. Meatloaf said, "You matter enough for me to shape something by hand and make it last." It was a meal you could smell from the hallway, and it always pulled you to the table. Whether you loved it or barely tolerated it, you remembered it. And maybe that is what gives a meal its weight. Not the flavor, but the memory. Quick crab dip earned its place on every 1970s buffet because it delivered rich seafood flavor with astonishing speed. A can of lump crab meat was drained and gently folded into softened cream cheese mixed with a splash of lemon juice, a shake of hot sauce, and a touch of Worcestershire for depth. Some hosts added a pinch of fresh dill or parsley for color, but the core recipe stayed wonderfully simple. The dip could be served cold with crackers and vegetable sticks or warmed briefly for a more indulgent spread. Either way, it offered the taste of a seaside restaurant without the cost or the wait. Guests loved the creamy texture and the subtle sweetness of real crab, while hosts appreciated that it could be made moments before a party and still impress a crowd. In a decade where convenience foods ruled but flavor remained king, quick crab dip stood out as a 5-minute marvel that felt like a luxury. It proved that a well-stocked pantry and a little creativity could bring the ocean to any suburban kitchen with almost no effort at all. Cornmeal mush with syrup was a humble breakfast favorite that transformed plain cornmeal into a warm, creamy mush sweetened with syrup, offering an affordable and comforting start to the day. This dish was popular in the 1970s because cornmeal was cheap, widely available, and had a long shelf life, making it perfect for families looking to make filling meals with little expense. Cooking cornmeal with water or milk until thickened created a soft base that could be served hot, and drizzling it with maple syrup or molasses added just the right amount of sweetness. Cornmeal mush could be eaten plain or topped with butter or fruit preserves when available, providing simple versatility. This breakfast was gentle on the stomach and quick to prepare, making it an excellent choice for busy mornings or colder seasons. Cornmeal mush with syrup reflected the era's emphasis on practical, hearty food that stretched budgets while keeping the family nourished and satisfied. Chicken a la king always sounded fancier than it was. The name suggested royalty, maybe even candlelight, but in practice, it was diced chicken swimming in a thick cream sauce, speckled with peas, pimentos, and mushrooms, spooned over toast or rice. It wasn't so much a king's meal as it was what his accountant might eat at a church luncheon. Yet, in the 1950s, it was a dinner party darling. You could whip it up with canned soup and leftover chicken, and suddenly your guests felt like they were somewhere special, if only for a moment. It had an elegance that came from effort rather than expense. Housewives folded and evaporated milk with precision, balancing salt and richness with the same care they gave their lipstick. Kids picked out the mushrooms, husbands sprinkled on pepper. And everyone agreed it beat meatloaf for the third night in a row. Chicken a la king wasn't really about the chicken, it was about pretending. Pretending you weren't scraping by, pretending your kitchen was a restaurant, pretending a ladle of creamy sauce could elevate anything, and for many it did. At least until the leftovers ran out. Almond green beans. Emendine were the quiet symbol of sophistication in the 1970s kitchen. Simple green beans were transformed by butter, lemon juice, and a generous handful of toasted slivered almonds. It was a dish that sparkled under dining room lights, fresh, glossy, and golden at the edges. The almonds added a satisfying crunch that balanced the tender vegetables perfectly. Many home cooks borrowed it straight from French cuisine, and for a while, it felt impossibly glamorous. Families served it at Thanksgiving or Easter, impressed by how such a light dish could still feel rich. Even the smell, a blend of toasted nuts and butter, made guests turn their heads toward the kitchen. It was quick to make, beautiful to look at, and almost too easy to eat. Though it faded as trends shifted toward heavier casseroles, green beans amandine remains the taste of understated 70s elegance. Ground beef and potato hash was a skillet meal that stretched a small amount of meat into something hearty enough to satisfy hungry stomachs after a long day. Diced potatoes were fried until golden and crisp, then combined with browned ground beef, onions, and simple seasonings. The result was a dish with plenty of texture, crispy edges on the potatoes, tender bits of beef, and the sweetness of caramelized onions tying it all together. This meal was endlessly adaptable, with some families adding vegetables like bell peppers or corn for extra flavor and bulk. It was a natural choice for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and it could be made in large batches without much extra effort. In frugal kitchens, hash was a way to make every ingredient count, turning basic staples into something satisfying and filling. It was also quick to prepare, making it a weeknight favorite. Served on its own or topped with a fried egg, ground beef and potato hash was the kind of no-frills comfort food that felt like a reward at the end of the day. It proved that even the simplest combinations could be deeply flavorful and endlessly comforting. Shepherd's pie was not just a dish, it was a plan. A bottom layer of seasoned ground beef and vegetables, topped with a cloud of mashed potatoes and baked until golden. You cut into it, and steam rose up like it had a story to tell. The meat was savory, the potatoes smooth, and every bite reminded you of warmth. This was the kind of meal that turned leftovers into a second chance. Even the potatoes might have been from the night before, whipped back to life with a splash of milk. You did not need a cookbook, just memory, instinct, and maybe your mother's voice in your head. It fed big families, tight schedules, and long winters without a word of complaint. In many homes, this was the only kind of pie anyone ever saw. It was food that used what was left and made it feel whole again. A casserole in form, but closer to a tradition in spirit. In homes with few frills, shepherd's pie was a celebration of thrift, a meal that gave more than it took. Watergate salad arrived with a mysterious name and a playful green color that fascinated every 1970s household. Pistachio pudding mix gave it that soft mint hue, while crushed pineapple added a tropical sweetness that made each spoonful refreshing. Whipped topping folded everything into a cloud-like texture, and miniature marshmallows added chewy little surprises with every bite. Some families tossed in chopped pecans for a gentle crunch, while others kept it smooth and creamy depending on what they had in the pantry. The entire recipe could be finished before the evening news even began, making it a hit for last-minute dessert needs or potluck contributions that required no stress. Children were drawn to the bright color, while adults appreciated the subtle, nutty flavor that set it apart from ordinary fruit salads and other quick sweets. Despite the political scandal sharing its name, Watergate salad kept its reputation as a cheerful treat for gatherings of all kinds and sizes. It required no stove, no oven, and no waiting, only a mixing bowl and a quick stir from start to finish. In less than 5 minutes, you could create something that looked whimsical and tasted indulgent, proving that the decade valued both speed and fun with a touch of flair. Hot dog and sauerkraut skillet was a quick, budget-friendly meal that combined inexpensive hot dogs with tangy canned sauerkraut, sautéed together for a flavorful one-pan dish. During the 1970s, this skillet meal was popular among families looking for easy dinners that required minimal preparation and affordable ingredients. The hot dogs, often store-brand or discounted, provided a salty, meaty base, while the sauerkraut added a sharp, vinegary bite that balanced the richness. Cooking both ingredients together allowed the flavors to meld, creating a comforting, savory dish perfect for busy weeknights. The skillet could be served with simple sides like bread or potatoes, stretching the meal further. This combination was especially appreciated in households where time and money were scarce, but good flavor was still desired. Hot dog and sauerkraut skillet exemplified the era's practical approach to home cooking: quick, tasty, and economical. Which vanished fair food do you remember most? Drop your memories in the comments and hit that like button. Subscribe so we can keep uncovering forgotten flavors and the mysterious stories behind why they disappeared from county fairs after 1975.